Hi, my name is Eric Reed, and today I'm going to be talking about gospel music and its roots. To be clear, gospel is not a style per se, but the word itself refers to an accounting or a message. In church talk or in Christendom, we say the gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news that Jesus lives. That's what gospel music, that's where the term comes from. So when you have gospel music, it's music that is preached from the Bible, applied to singing, telling of biblical stories, biblical characters, talking about God, holiness, etc. So when the term gospel music was penned in about the late 1800s, it was a distinction from the hymn from the 1600s or the 1500s, the spiritual, which comes from African slaves brought to the United States, and gospel blues, which is a loose term that Thomas Dorsey, Reverend Thomas Dorsey versus Tommy Dorsey, the trombone player, Reverend Thomas Dorsey penned in about the 1920s or so. And I'm going to show you some examples, the differences between all of these different genres or styles. Gospel music was supposed to be easier, more accessible to sing versus what was called the church hymn. So if we take a song like "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" by Martin Luther from about 1528, I'll play an example of that, and then you'll hear the melody, you'll hear the beauty of it, it's a beautiful song, but you'll hear why maybe it's not quite so easy to sing or as accessible. Now, as you can hear, it's a beautiful melody, but not necessarily that easy to sing. Again, that's about 1528. So the gospel song came along, or the term gospel music or gospel song, in about the late 1800s. Here's a song called "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone." Now, it was adapted from a Scottish song called "Maitland." But this song, and a lot of times the music would come either before or after. Oftentimes these songs weren't co-composed. Sometimes there were songs or melodies that were based on poems that existed, like with "Amazing Grace." John Newton is given credit for writing this poem, "Amazing Grace," this accounting of the way he was feeling when he wrote the lyrics, when he wrote the words, and then the music was added sometime later. That happened quite a bit. This is a composition, Maitland, or "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone," which is based loosely on the hymn, but it's known as a gospel song. So that was about 1844 when that was published. And it sounds similar to the hymn, played in the hymn style or four-part harmony, as it were, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. But it's got a different, more singable melody. And the lyrics were easier to sing too. If you think about hymns that were written in the 1500s that come from Europe, Germans and French and things like that, and then the English translated, it was much harder to sing. It was like singing music in Shakespeare talk, as they, thee and thou, and those old English. So we've got "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone," that's gospel music. And then along comes Reverend Thomas Dorsey, who writes a composition called "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," in about 1930, 31, 32, somewhere in there. And it's very closely connected to "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone." In fact, it's almost the same song, but it's different words. And the term gospel blues is something that Thomas Dorsey used to describe his music, which was the hymn through the spiritual, through gospel music, but using the blues. Reverend Thomas Dorsey was born in Villa Rica, Georgia, and then eventually moved up to Chicago, which became known as the home of gospel music, or the birth of gospel music. Mahalia Jackson, all these people up there, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, they were all there in Chicago at the same time, if you can imagine that. So Thomas Dorsey comes up with this style. He was raised playing gospel music in the church, but he became known as a very popular and very successful blues musician before he became known as a gospel music composer or player and singer. So he combined the style of gospel music, something like Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone, and the idea of the gospel blues. And again, we're talking about gospel being the good news. So his compositions became more preaching and charismatically oriented in their interpretation. And also, the melodies were not sung nearly as straight, because out of the African tradition, again, we get this whole idea of singing off the page, or line or shape note singing, more improvisation. And what we call now today, we call it the melisma. When you hear all of these gospel singers, or a lot of these R&B and popular singers, they sing the line and then they do all these little twists and turns and acrobatics and pyrotechnics around the note, when it's really just one note that's part of the melody. So this is Take My Hand, Precious Lord. Now, if you go to any black church in the United States, you'll never ever hear it played like that, because the music doesn't come from off the page, it comes from out of here. Now, Thomas Dorsey was a proficient musician. He knew how to write and read music, so he also got very heavily involved in the business side by publishing his own songs. I'm sure you're familiar with the term Tin Pan Alley. Well, in Chicago, they didn't have Tin Pan Alley per se like they had in New York City for the Great American Songbook with Richard Rodgers and George Gershwin and things like that. But there were situations in areas of black Chicago where they would stand on the corner singing their songs, and that's how they promoted their music. And I believe at that time, Thomas Dorsey collaborated with Dr. Sally Martin, and they would sell lead sheets for about 10 cents or something like that, if you can imagine that. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the way that you would generally hear it, for the most part, in just any black church. You could just throw a rock and hit a black church where it would sound something like this. Not nearly as straight, and somewhat rubato or out of time. So through that, you can hear all of the blues, the jazz, the spiritual style. You hear several triads or even some extended chords. You hear all of the influences of European music, of the African style, of westernized music, all of that involved in the sound of what Reverend Thomas Dorsey called the gospel blues. And it would be even more effective with a singer, if you can imagine that. The power of somebody like Mahalia Jackson or Bessie Griffin or any of those great gospel singers of the day.